All right, welcome everybody to the Eastis podcast. Today I am taking over from Sina. My name is Matteo. I've co-hosted other episodes before. Joining us today is first Essam Elkorghli, who's going to be the co-host with me. Essam is a PhD student from Libya, a labor organizer with his university union, and a member of a global Pan-African movement. He researches the ideological impact of imperialism on education in Libya and the global south in post-2011, especially considering the gift that NATO has done to Libya. Now, joining with us today, the reason why me and Essam came together, because we are very excited to have with us Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of Southeastern Norway, if I'm correct. Professor Diesen, Glenn, is an expert on Russia, on the geoeconomic and political strategy of Russia and the bigger Eurasia and Russian conservatism as well. So joining with us today is Glenn. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Glenn, today.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
So Glenn, today we're gonna basically try to prompt you on different questions and different directions around, Russia, the moment in which Europe is vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. But also, I'd like to start to break the ice with this wonderful question that I heard at Davos, which is, are we winning the war, or should I say, are we not losing the war? This is the question that was posed to the NATO head, Stoltenberg. So starting from there, Glenn, tell us, are we winning, are we not losing the war? And most importantly, how did you become an expert on Russia? If you can tell us a little bit about your path, also to our listeners, how does a European become an expert on Russia? And how does it make it then to leave, working on Russia?
Well, I didn't actually work much in Norway. After the 90s, I moved out of Norway for 20 years. The majority of those years I was in Australia, actually. But I wrote one of my books the book's called Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for Greater Eurasia, in which I look towards the political economy of Russia seeking to decouple from the West and going towards the East, looking at the theoretical framework in terms of why I argue this is the path they will take. And back then, of course, it was very controversial to suggest that China and Russia would somehow be this duo, because this was back in 2014-15 I wrote this book. But everyone said it was a marriage of convenience. But anyways, I wrote this other book. So yeah, long story short, I wanted to have the foreword to be written by someone in Russia, and I contacted the advisor to President Putin on Eurasianism, which is Professor Sergei Karaganov. And then he wrote the foreword. And then later on, I was offered a job to work there in his department. So we left Australia then, and we went to Russia in Moscow, and we're working there. And then we came here to Norway during the pandemic. But that was, again, 20 years away. So there was, I don't have any good path for anyone in this country, though. But
Well, that's good to hear from you, because each one has his own, personal path in trying to discover the war and understanding the events around us. The way you do and the way you make, you've been having a lot of interviews. I've seen you commenting on so many, on the unfortunate events that's happening in Ukraine as well. And today we want you to start. Basically, our first prompt for you would be, it's about Russia, which directly, goes back to your work on Russophobia and the work of the think tank racket in the way they manage the information war with Russia. So the first question for you would be, for us, is how did Russia transition from this sort of docile, calm political formation to a large threat to the existing world order? Or was it already a threat? And, how is this articulated? Is this even the right articulation that we see in the Western mainstream media, or would you put it differently?
No, I think, in my opinion, the Western mainstream media has become very, very propagandistic. I don't think they're assessing Russia accurately at all. I think this is simply the way during conflicts media tend to become, journalists becomes information warriors. So the media amplifies any story that puts Russia in negative light, and they ignore anything that's positive. If you read the Western media now, it seems like Russia hasn't achieved anything in the past 20 years. Look, in the 90s, the country looked like it was collapsing, and today, they've done a lot of things right, but you can't really mention anything because everything has to fit within a specific narrative. But in terms of Russia's challenging of the world order, I would say it gone through many stages because Russia initially had this what they call the Greater Europe Initiative. That is, since Gorbachev's time, they wanted to aspire to develop this Greater European home. Uh, then, of course, Yeltsin thought it was more possible if they divorced themselves from this Soviet Union and became an independent country and abandoned communism, all of this. And they just wanted to be pro-Western. They ignored their partnership with Central Asia, China. They just wanted, anything that could hold them back. They just wanted to join this inclusive European security system. And we agreed with them. In 1990, we signed this Charter of Paris for a new Europe. We agreed no more dividing lines. We're going to have indivisible security. We formed a common security institution with them in 94, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So everything seemed to be on path, what they wanted. And then came NATO expansion instead. And this was the exact opposite, because suddenly everything was turned on its head. We said, we're going to expand the borders, expand the dividing lines towards the east instead of removing them, all of this. And this became the big problem for relations between the West and Russia. Essentially, all the major American officials and experts all recognized that this was going to be a huge problem. But again, as they said back then, Russia was weak, who cares? But anyways, the Russians always they still wanted this greater Europe. Putin just thought, we need to negotiate from a position of strength instead of being weak on the outside, asking for handouts. And they kept offering, under Medvedev, they had a proposal for an inclusive Europe. Putin in 2010 proposed this EU-Russia union with free trade, but everything was rejected. And but people still held on to it. But in 2014 was that very crucial year, because when the Western governments supported the coup in Ukraine, that became evident that Ukraine would be a front line against Russia instead of a bridge. Because if you're going to make Ukraine part of NATO, given that in 2014 only 20% of Ukrainians wanted to be part of NATO, you're going to have to purge all the Russian-friendly opposition, and again, you're going to have to move in a lot of military infrastructure into Ukraine, which would threaten Russian security. So this is the year when they abandoned Greater Europe. Until then, the goal was, our main difference with Russia was, we wanted a Europe where everyone was included except Russia, and we would kind of use our collective bargaining power to have asymmetrical interdependence with them. So they would, be very dependent on us. We would shed most dependence on them. Make a little Middle East out of them. We should get, natural resources from them, and we should, dictate their policies. Yeah, it sounds very derogatory, and it's meant to be. Anyways, but again, after 2014, this changed because then Russia had a new ambition. They said, this has been a utopian dream. Let's be more realistic. The future is in the East. So the Europeans and the West, they saw, was stagnant. The East was much more dynamic. The West was hostile. The East was welcoming. So suddenly they abandoned this whole idea of Greater Europe. And indeed, I keep making a point. I would argue they also abandoned 300 years of Western-centric foreign policy since Peter the Great, and they instead looked at modernization means going east. So it's China, India, the Arab states, Iran, Korea, anyone in the east, and of course the global majority, if you will. So this is, and at this point now, that's a completely new challenge to the entire world order, because at this point in time, they're looking to undo the unipolar moment of the United States. And if you look at what China because in 2015 the Chinese launched this, began to launch this Belt and Road Initiative. Sorry, that was the years before 2013, but in 2015 they launched this China 2025. So suddenly the Chinese, made their clear ambition that they were going to be a technological leader. They're going to develop all this new transportation corridors, the new banks, use their own currency. And this kind of coincided with what Russia wanted. They realized, China will be the leading economy, but at least it won't have the same zero-sum format as that in Europe. So, sorry, I know a long introduction to it, but I think that's how we got to where we are now. To create a unipolar moment after the Cold War, we couldn't include Russia, and so we kind of pushed them out, and now we pushed them to China, in the global majority, and it proves out that instead of accommodating a large ally, we have now alienated an even more powerful adversary.
So, Glenn, if I may, I have a question that's kind of tagged to another question, which what you mentioned in your book, which is going to be the topic of the next question, related to the Chechnya war. That was kind of what you mentioned is the first challenge to kind of the West, that where Russia decided to act militarily based on a sovereign decision. But then also, but from that example, you also talk about what the events happened in Yugoslavia and Kosovo. Russia observing all of that as it unfolded, the bombing and NATO intervention and so forth. But drawing back from these events, maybe you can use them as examples in your answer, but your book on Russophobia does a very interesting and renewed job of understanding propaganda, Russophobic propaganda, a recipe that is kind of on a global scale to produce what you call legitimizing hierarchies in the international system of sovereign inequality. So can you explain this theory that's outlined in the book through the use of these militaristic examples or non-militaristic examples?
Well, sovereign inequality is to some extent always been at the core of the world order. That is, when you go back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, it's based on sovereign states and the balance of power. But it's also European order. And so when the Europeans went around the world, you had the sovereignty for civilized states, and again, sounds very derogatory and is meant to be. And then for barbaric, uncivilized states, they did not get sovereignty. Obviously, not reflecting my opinion, but this is how you structure the international system. Now, this is through the 1800s. This was all literature on this, on liberal imperialism. The idea that if you think there's a universal ideals and the universal path to development, and the liberal West is the champion of it, then effectively that makes the West, that gives them the right and the responsibility to lead the rest of the world in this way. So it becomes the role of the West to civilize the rest of the world. So again, you have the civilizing mission. And again, this has reproduced itself to some extent in, through democratization, human rights. So, remaking the world in our own view. The problem here is you limit the sovereignty of other states. Again, humanitarian interventionism, it only goes one way. You can't interfere in domestic affairs of the West, but you can do in the domestic affairs of others. So I think from Yugoslavia, especially in 1999, this became quite evident when the West attacked Yugoslavia in order to, due to the conflict in Kosovo. It was then deemed that the conflict was illegal. The invasion of Yugoslavia was illegal, but legitimate, it was said. Illegal because it didn't go with the United Nations, didn't have a mandate, but it was said to be legitimate given that there were human rights abuses, and Russia and China didn't care about human rights. That was the argument. So this is quite interesting, because this is when you see legality decoupling from legitimacy, and we're using liberal democracy as a way to legitimize something besides international law. So this is what we're talking about when we. The United States doesn't talk much about international law anymore. They talk about the rules-based international order, and this is where it's based. It's this idea that you kind of mix international law with human rights, which sounds wonderful, but what you do is you come with two competing principles. So and it's always decided based on power politics. So let's say, if you have a oppressed minority, perhaps, do you go with self-determination, which would be the liberal ideal principle, or do you go with the territorial integrity, which is by international law? Well, it all depends. If it's Kosovo, then, well, self-determination. If it's Crimea, well, then it's definitely territorial integrity. If it's Taiwan now, the process of shifting towards self-determination. So it's a way of picking and choosing. So it doesn't actually have any specific rules. It's just it's a way of giving allowing a hegemonic rule. I think this is the best way under the guise of advancing liberal ideals. So, needless to say, this is not acceptable to other rising powers, be it China, Russia, India, even American allies. So,
yeah, and most likely also to this emerging strategic formation in the Arab world, the Middle East, the axis of resistance as well. Where we're seeing, what always struck me when I was listening to your commentary and I was reading your work is that the trajectory that Russia has been seeing is very much started to resonate with countries I am familiar with and the work I'm familiar with, which is in the region of the Middle East. The propaganda, you describe a lot about this way of framing Russia, like Russia is a threat. Russia is always like there is this Russophobia, that you discuss. And which, by the way, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this as well, because coming from a Marxist tradition myself, I'm very much familiar with the work of Domenico Lo Surdo, which has this beautiful book. I don't know if it's translated in English, but it's called Historical Revisionism, Myth and Problems, Mythologies and Problems, something like that. And he actually goes and traces Russia as a threat going back to the Russian Revolution. So since then, with the Russian Revolution in 1917, you have Russia being framed as a threat. Then it continues to be under communism. And then it seems that, there is a legacy of that threat on Russia's history, at least to the European liberal eyes, that continues. I don't know if you see that as a continuity as well as self, but my question would be more about if you can walk us through in how you developed also a little bit more about this, the theory of propaganda that you have in the book.
Well, first on the role of Russia in the European view, because in sociology you learn the way human beings create the collective. Like, you have to define who are us. It always have to be mirroring the other. So again, in the West, it's always been mirrored to the East, so that the East becomes the other. So Russia's always been this convenient East to our West, but it's also been always, if we are civilized, it's contrasted to Russia, who is the barbarian. We are European, they are Asiatic because of their background from from the Mongol occupation for 250 years. And we are maritime powers, they are land powers. So they've always been exactly the opposite. So if you look at for example, Edward Said's work on Orientalism, this is Russia kind of became the Orient in Europe. So if you follow the rhetoric all the way up to World War II and thereafter, they always talk about Asiatic barbarians at the gates of Europe. And some would say this. I put some traces back 500 years when they tried to re-enter to be a part of Europe civilization again after they shed the Mongol yoke. And but again, it really kicked in hard, especially for the British after the defeat of Napoleon, because that became a big wake-up call. And that's something the British academics have written a lot about too, that this is when, for a variety of reasons, when they began to see Russia as a huge threat, because they threatened them, maritime-based empire of the British. They and also they became this huge force, which also gave a reason. Because if Russia's the big threat that could defeat Napoleon, suddenly that became an incentive for former rivals, being Britain and France, to cooperate as well. So a lot of Western solidarity began to be dependent on a collective resistance towards Russia. So again, this is something that obviously intensified under communism, because then this binary division continued. We're capitalists, they're communists, we're Christians, they're atheists, we're democracies, they're authoritarians. So this kind of continued, this recasting of the civilized versus the barbarian. And this was, I think, a key challenge after the Cold War, when we decided to redivide Europe. We recast this us versus them. We're the liberal democracies, and they have to be the authoritarians. And again, it's a very reductionist, unhelpful way of interpreting the complexities of the world. I forgot your second question. Sorry.
Go ahead. You take over.
I think with this whole notion of delegitimizing anything that Russia does, essentially, or framing them as the evil of all evils, bringing it so instead of just the 20th century, now the 21st century, and not necessarily a Crimea situation or Georgia or Chechnya, but particularly the Syria, which is also, you mentioned in your book, their intervention in Syria. How can we understand that is an additional layer of why the West continues adamantly and blatantly frame Russia as the evil of all those nice values of the West, of democracy and freedom and liberalism, especially their intervention in Syria?
Well, that links nicely up with the former question, which I forgot, which was how propaganda is then formulated. And I always, to understand how Russia's presented then in the West, also in Syria, you kind of have to look at what the propaganda is, and often it's you can consider it the marketing of politics. So for example, if you buy a car, you don't buy a mode of transportation, you buy status. You buy something else, and this is how you sell things. Now, this is not a coincidence. One of the the main literature on political propaganda came from an American who worked for the Wilson administration in the U.S., who's Edward Bernays. So he did marketing campaigns. So he would do like cigarettes. Instead of selling cigarettes, here's a thing with puff smokes and makes you cough. It's you have to label it somehow. So you label it freedom. This was torches of emancipation or freedom, if freedom torches, something along those lines. And so it's supposed to strengthen women because they had to find a way to make women smoke. And and after that, he used the same propaganda. It was by the way, his uncle was Sigmund Freud, and he developed a lot of these ideas from psychology, where he looked at the group psychology, because the individual, we tend to think of ourselves as very rational, but we also have a group instinct, because human beings organize in groups. We adopt the ideas of the groups, and there's a lot of irrational aspects of humankind, and kind of his nephew Edward Bernays kind of built on this. Anyways, he also all these marketing tricks, he also noticed it could be used in politics. So, for example, in Guatemala, when they had the nationalized what is called the United Fruit Company, or no, not nationalized. He passed some working laws. I forgot the details now. Anyways, so the Americans, they didn't care for this, and they thought, okay, well, what can we do? And Bernays began to brand him in his marketing campaigns, if you will, as being a communist. He was not a communist by any stretch of the imagination, but still, later on, that gave all the legitimacy required to invade. So, and this is kind of the same ideas that were later used. And so propaganda effectively then means that you convince your audience without appealing to the rational or to reason. You rely on building stereotypes. And so nothing really matters. If the stereotype is, we are civilized, we care about human rights and democracy, the Russians are evil, they want empires, they want to subjugate, they hate freedom, the opposite of us. If you accept these stereotypes, facts no longer matter. Because if we invade a country, well, we were worried about human rights, we want to spread democracy. It might have not been it might have been wrong, but we did it for the right reasons. But if Russia would do the same, invade, well, they would be in pursuit of empire, to crush freedom and enslave people. So, and even if they do something right, they would do it for the wrong reason. So if you build these stereotypes, facts no longer really matter that much, because everything is filtrated. The world is complex. You have to filter. We always filter everything we see in the world through some prisms we have learned. And all you have to do is construct those ideas, and then you control largely how people view the world. And yeah.
No, and I think, yeah, potentially, but this recently, like a year ago, Russia just canceled the debt of more than $20 billion to a number of African countries. But people are calling that soft power, trying to influence Russian allies, or create Russian allies, or influence sovereign African states to be submissive to Russia. But obviously, they don't look at the fact that World Bank, IMF, EU, US institutions, they never did such a thing to actually cancel a debt, right? They always like to get something in return, such as properties or whatever, structural adjustments and so forth. But constantly there's the articulation that whatever they do is always malign Russian activities. But I would like to get a point to our audience, especially people who are interested in the Middle East, about the Syria intervention particularly. How did it shake the pillars of Western hegemony and imperialism? In your view, if you have thoughts on it.
Well, in Syria, first let me say I agree with what you said first as well, because has anyone in the West opened a newspaper ever and read anything about Russia which is positive? What conclusion can we reach? Has nothing positive happened in Russia the past 30 years? Go visit Russia and see what the country looks like now. They've built an excellent society there. They've developed so much, but we never read any positive stories. So how can that be? And so you're right, everything is negative. But they do the same now with the Chinese as well. They can build hospitals and roads and bridges and railroads. They can cancel the debt and whatever. But we're talking about the debt trap and China taking over Africa and. Yeah, string of pearls. Yeah, so it doesn't really. Everything is exploitative, and But again, it falls within this civilizing mission idea that it's a pedagogic idea here, that we are the good parental figure. We're looking after the world. We're going to make sure that the Africans aren't exploited by the evil Chinese. We're going to look after Latin America, that the evil Chinese don't come and take over. And sorry, I'll get to your question one second. But all propaganda stories have this one. So, for example, in during the Crimean War in the 1850s, at that time, before then, the Turks had been presented as some evil, like this barbaric Muslims who were always going after the Greek. But then, when they were in conflict with the Russians, the story was reinvented, because in every story you need the evil perpetrator, and that was Russia, and then you have the poor victim, which was brutalized, which was the Turks, and then of course you have the savior, which was the British and the French, who would come and rescue the poor Turkish maiden from this onslaught by the evil Russians. So you always have this role: perpetrator, victim, and then the savior. And back then, many Brits were writing about how remarkably quick that narrative about Turkey changed. But again, this is how you have to build the stereotypes, because once you accept those three stereotypes, everything is interpreted through that prism. So, regarding Syria, I think this came as a big, big shock, because suddenly we've accepted that since Henry Kissinger, who gets tribute for splitting the Soviets from the Chinese, but he also expelled the Russians from the Middle East. Suddenly you have, we're in the middle of a regime change war there, supporting the opposition to get rid of Assad, and suddenly Russia intervenes to support the Syrian government. And it's I think it people then began to recognize that the destiny of Syria would be determined by Moscow, effectively, that whether or not they would collapse or survive, or be split up. So I think this was a huge shock to the system, but it also then reinforced the idea that Russia is our enemy. But again, because never mind the hundreds of thousands who died. This was it's always the same narrative. No, we were there supporting all these militants because Assad is evil, he kills his own people, and we want to support human rights and democracy in Syria. Even though at the same time, if you go behind the media narrative, you go all the think tanks, what they're talking about, taking out one of Israel's adversaries, taking out a friend of Iran, expelling the Russians from Syria, prevent them from having a naval base. These are the actual cold hard interests. But the way it was sold to the public was, of course, we're democracy promoters. So it doesn't matter what happens. You have revelations that they were backing Al Qaeda in the region. But it doesn't matter. It's Al Qaeda here is our ally, in promoting democracy, and the U.S. and Saudi Arabia destabilizing and training these rebel groups. Yeah, it's for human rights, because this is also top of the priority for Saudi Arabia too. It's just it's very strange, but. Anyway, it's long story short. I think this was a quite important moment in which the return of Russia, shook the West.
Yeah, and I think if we look at the Syrian at the Russian intervention in Syria, which was called upon the Syrian government, and definitely this was, Syria was definitely a big moment. I think we can all agree on that. There is also another moment which, unfortunately affects us in a way, because we've been very close, particularly me and Essam, in working. Essam is sitting right now in Libya, which was, Russia response also to the Libyan events. It's always said that, Russia was very surprised. They abstained, they didn't veto the UN resolution, which then eventually led to the regime change, and the NATO led, again, humanitarian intervention and regime change war. And so Russia, in a way, that what happened in Libya prompted as well Russia to change its attitude, which eventually led to the intervention in Syria. And then, so my first question is your thoughts in a way of Russia's reaction to Libya. Was that really a surprise when they saw what happened after the resolution? And then how this basically eventually led to Russia's policy towards Ukraine, especially in 2022.
Yeah, well, the Russians were quite open about their sentiment around Libya. And again, the sentiment thereafter was largely, never again. They fooled us there. So if you want to look at Russia being quite uncompromising in Syria, it was to a large extent the lessons learned from what happened in Libya, and it also changed the political. The leading political class and sentiments in Moscow as well, because back those days you had President Medvedev, head of Russia, and he was very liberal, very optimistic about the opportunity to work closer with the West, and but if you see him today, he's one of the largest hawks they have. He wants Alaska back pretty much. So they have. So they kind of created a monster in him, though. But this is also Putin. He goes back and saying, we were at times naive. We thought we could work with them, and we couldn't. So the sense, we often talk about the way we feel Russia betrayed us, but we kind of ignore the sense of betrayal there. And again, what was done in Libya, the destruction of the country, pillaging of resources. This is something that definitely motivated Russia to take a more hardline position against NATO in Syria.
Yeah, definitely. And so, considering this trajectory that we're seeing Russia, let's say from 2011, we're coming also from me and Essam towards the African and the West Asia through the West Asia focus. But I would like to hear your thoughts, as how much these two events, Libya, Syria, and then eventually moving slowly to what happened because we have Ukraine in 2014. How do all these events on your, do you think they shaped Russia, political trajectory in dealing with Ukraine and eventually deciding to go for a military operation? How basically the events that, by looking at Libya and then Syria, the political trajectory that as of US the American project of domination towards the Middle East. So Russia is looking at this, and then how this it affected Russia's vis-a-vis Ukraine in the way it decided to shape its own policy.
Yeah, well, a lot of these incidents, of course, overlapped. So with Ukraine, this was by far the largest shock to Russia because, again, in 2013, the Europeans were pushing this association agreement, which, by the way, broke the agreement the Europeans had with the Russians. We had a common space agreement. We agreed that we would harmonize integration towards the shared neighborhood. Obviously, the association agreement was very much zero sum. The Russians and Ukrainians tried whatever they could. They proposed. Kyiv and Moscow proposed to the EU to have a trilateral agreement, so they wouldn't force Ukraine to choose between East or West. But again, as the main message from the EU was, this is a civilizational choice. You have to choose us or the Russians. So this civilization choice, it does come up quite often, actually, if you go through the rhetoric. But anyways, when Ukraine made the wrong decision and decided to not go with the EU's association agreement, that's of course when the EU leaders started, and American leaders started to come down to Maidan in Kyiv and give their support to the rioters and seeking then to, as you saw in the media, then suddenly shifted from being a government to a regime, which is a good indication that they're looking to get rid of them. And it was a very overt coup, which is why a lot of the things, conversations at the time were leaked actually by the Russians. So the Piat and the Nuland conversation where they planned, who should be in government after they get rid of Yanukovych, like 2 weeks in advance. All of this, this kind of came as a huge surprise to the Russians. And if you look at what they did, actually decide to stage a referendum in Crimea and take back the peninsula, it kind of showed that they had. They believed there was no more ways to work with the West. The West would go after this naval base. So again, Crimea is the most important thing for the British and Americans to expel the Russians from the Black Sea. And so this was also a huge decision. And of course, this but still, there were some people in Moscow who believed that they could still reconcile or make things work with the West. Indeed, if they took Crimea as the huge trophy of Ukraine away from the Americans, perhaps there would be less to fight about. So people often ignore that Putin wanted. There was a lot of calls for recognizing Donbass as independence, but he said that would destroy relations not just with Crimea, now with Ukraine, but also the West. So he actually went against all of this in the hope that he can find a way of working with the West. But slowly, year by year, everything went from bad to worse, and the peace agreements that the West had committed to, which were negotiated by the Germans and French. As later both the Germans and the French admitted. Yeah, with Minsk agreement, it was just to buy time to arm Ukraine. So this was, but again, all of this happened at the same time as Syria played out, as the Russians went in October of 2015. So it's a good question whether or not Russia would have gone to those gone to these huge lengths if it hadn't been for relations already being spoiled. Again, it's would be a lot of counterfactuals and
that's right. Yes,
exactly. Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the things that I guess think tanks, which is the topic of the next kind of segment, they like to portray that a lot of Russia's policies are done at a whim, done based on authoritarian personality of Putin. It's not well studied, as if they don't have institutions who actually, with a foresight and complete contemplation of what are the consequences of their actions, and hence they have these sporadic invasions of countries nearby. And obviously they like to use this term unprovoked invasion. And this is kind of tangential, but it's ironic in my field that nobody questions the language, how be it in Western mass media, in much of the think tanks, what they produce is that whenever they talk about the conflict that's ongoing, the militarized one in Ukraine, they talk about it as unprovoked invasion, unprovoked aggression, so there is a kind of a construction of consent. But who creates this kind of narrative? Think tanks. So your newer book, or I guess the newest book, is largely about think tanks and their role in how they assuage the viewers and listeners and readers to think negatively about Russia's all doings, be it in Kazakhstan, Georgia, Libya, whatever you name it. So can you tell us a little bit about the rise of think tank industry, especially in relation to what's happening in Ukraine since 2022?
Well, first this idea of unprovoked. I always made the argument that this is the key phrase to pay attention to in Ukraine, because they keep repeating that over and over and over again, and you can prove beyond any doubt that this was as provoked as it could be. It would be as if Russia or China establishing a military base in or military alliance with Mexico and moving in their weapons, modernizing their ports for their warships, getting rid of all basic rights for Americans living there. I mean, it would be it's just quite absurd, but it's quite important to call it unprovoked, because unprovoked, because if it's unprovoked, then Russia's pursuing empire, subjugating a neighboring country. Then you have to increase the cost of this military opportunism, so you send all the weapons in the world. Now, if you are recognized it was provoked, then everything we're doing is escalating the conflict. So this has been the key word we said from day one, and that's part of the crime, which is why I've gone very hard against the unprovoked one, that argument. But no, think tanks are that was my 11th book, think tanks. It was it was sorry. It's they have they can have quite an important role, because I make the point in the book that politicians, they're not they don't necessarily, well, even if they were the smartest ones, they can't know everything. The world is getting more and more complex, all everything from economic policy to foreign policy. It's a lot to know, so they rely often on outsourcing or getting expert opinion. The problem with academics is often we sit with very specific, very narrow little issues we look at. And also most discussions end up being about concepts and methods and theories. So think tanks can be quite helpful. They provide policies, ideas, policy briefs. They can give expert advice to politicians. The problem is they become they get a lot of power then, and this is what was discovered. They get a lot of influence. Well, does it really matter who you vote for if you can own the guy who whispers in their ear? Because if you're going to give all the policy advice, then imagine all the accumulation of power. If you have monopolized on creating knowledge, or perceived knowledge at least, because look at what the think tank's doing. They have a huge role in the buildup of administrations, because when politicians are out of office, they use think tanks as a waiting room. So they hire them. All the politicians now these days are fellas in some kind of a think tank, and then when they're done, when they can get back into office, then they have one of their guys on the inside. They even keep their position as a fella in this or that think tank. These think tanks also then so they have direct influence in the administrations. They're also the one giving these policy briefs to the politicians, presidential administrations. They give the recommendations at congressional hearings. And so not only do they have an influence over the politicians, but they can also mobilize the public, because when the media needs expert opinion, they have a huge list of think tanks with great resources who are willing to come with their opinions. They can write their own pieces and send them in. So there's an immense influence from these think tanks. And then effectively that means you have now political influence for sale, the ultimate neoliberal capitalism, when even foreign policies for sale. Now, who would be interested in buying a foreign policy? Who would want to buy all of this influence? Well, the first obviously would be arms industry, and that just happens to be pretty much the main financier of every single one of these think tanks. So this is a key part of the problem. You have this huge arms industry who are pumping in, billions of dollars into these think tanks. And they go to the politicians, to Congress, to the media, and they kind of launder their political influence. And for me, this becomes a form of political propaganda, because in propaganda, it's quite important to have source credibility. You can't just have a military official there with medals and saying this or that. You want to make it, create a human rights organization, a fake one, or like the National Endowment for Democracy. Create these think tanks, and make them go out there and pretend to be academics and independents. But you see, every time when these think tanks want to give advice on any foreign policy, it's always war is always the first choice, pretty much, and it gives a huge bias for direct conflict, and you dehumanize the opposition. You never want to put yourself in the foot of the opponent. So when have any of these think tanks, when they inform media or politicians, ever try to explain, well, what are the security concerns for Russia or the Chinese? What are they worried about? If we can mitigate their concerns, then they would not have to respond, and then that would improve our security, and there wouldn't be any military conflict. There's no money in that, so you tend to have weapons always being huge influence. Again, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's their business. You're trying to make money, weapons is what you sell. And so in that book, I also write a bit about the decision to expand NATO. Now, obviously, the arms industry and the think tanks weren't the only influence, but New York Post, New York Times, Washington Post, they all wrote about this, how much money the arms industry could make if we expand NATO, and all these Eastern Europeans would have to start buying American weapons. So suddenly NATO expansion became this huge cash cow for the arms industry, and then you saw the think tanks trying to convince everyone in Washington that no, this isn't going to start a Cold War with Russia, like George Kennan argued. No, this will be peaceful. This will be great. So it's, I think it's been very detrimental, and more focus, I think, should be devoted to this influence of the think tanks.
This is an absolutely important point, and I really enjoyed reading your book, honestly, especially the one on the think tank racket. Why? Because it just resonated with me so much. When you're looking at the Middle East, and I'm not going to mention now the question of, the question of Palestine as well. There is the war industry and there is the human rights industry on that. I mean, the whole point is that providing policies to that part of the world is a way to strip them of their sovereignty completely. Obviously, you have to destroy them first and foremost. But we've seen this so much with Libya. It's just unbelievable as well that the pockets of academics, which for me are mercenaries, honestly, that they take part into creating, producing this kind of knowledge, which is connected to this political economy that you describe so much. And it's really it's so influential, because it really becomes then a sort of, they do a job of gatekeeping in the production of knowledge when it comes to the academic world, obviously. They do a job of smearing and demonizing you, and we're going to get there with you as well, because I really want to understand how you survive, because we're seeing this when we talk about Israel, which, obviously it's bogus in Europe to talk about that from a critical point of view. So I'm just, but before we move to that, you made a lot of the time this point between reason and propaganda. So what happened to reason, Glenn? What is reason? Can we still find reason anywhere?
Well, it's not. If reason is what we should have in an open society, we should have political discussions, we should have debates. But if reason doesn't win the argument, we would tend to lean on propaganda, and propaganda is well, again, you see the same basic structures as you see, NATO versus Russia. You also see in the Middle East, because even now, as genocide is unfolding, what do we say? Oh, well, you have Israel, it's an aspiring democracy, the only democracy in the region. They're the most moral military, and then you have Palestinians. Well, they're represented by Hamas. They're terrorists. They're evil. So again, you have the same civilized side versus the barbarian, and this is how everything should be interpreted. So so suddenly, we're looking to make excuses for the killing of thousands of children. It's like, yeah, well, I guess it's Hamas's fault. There's tunnels somewhere. People are fed these kind of catchphrases and slogans, and at the same time, so this is how you mobilize people as well, because people tend to, form their opinions based on adopting that of the group that around them. So you don't have to convince every person. You just you have to make it seem like there's a consensus, and that's why it's important. If anyone sticks their head out and begin to argue against it, it's important to chop that head off very quickly, because if you see everyone around you saying the exact same thing, oh, this was unprovoked, or oh, that's just Hamas a terrorist, then you won't stick your head out either. So it's important to give the image of or impression of consensus. Now, obviously, if we this idea of a democracy versus a terrorists, if this is the only, but this is good versus evil. This is what we always do. If this is the only way of explaining it, this is not a rational debate to have. This has a propagandistic structure. A rational one would be to, have a critical discussion about, what are Israel's options in the region, because, in the area we see of Greater Israel now, about, the Jews are about half the population. So if you want a Jewish state, what are you going to do with all of the Palestinians and the Arabs? Because you can then you can have apartheid, where you have one set of law for the Jews and one for the Palestinians, which you have in the West Bank, or you can ethnically cleanse them by pushing people from Gaza into Egypt, or you can kill them through genocide. But otherwise, those are the three options. Otherwise, you can't. If you're going to have all these people be allowed to be inside of what they want, a Greater Israel, then it won't be a Jewish nation state anymore. So this is the problem. Israel, it sabotaged, which Netanyahu keeps saying quite openly, very proud of. He sabotaged the two-state solution. Well, if you sabotage the two-state solution, where are the Palestinians going to go? Again, either they have to live in your state under apartheid, you kick them out, which is ethnic cleansing, or you kill them. I'm not sure what other alternatives there is. I'm always asking. And then, usually the answer is, yeah, but they're terrorists. But, I don't care about Hamas. Like this, you have to be honest about what are you going to do with this Palestinian issue. And now they're saying, Europeans should take them, send them to Congo, let's build an island for them. It's just, this is still ethnic cleansing. You're seeking to remove people from a territory. So there's no, I don't see any rational debate. And of course,
it's warring. Yeah, it's definitely warring. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wish if they, as you said earlier, they never use the same framework as self-determination and territorial integrity. They interchangeably use these terms based on their political whims and interests. And the same thing, like, in Libya, when there were just 100 only, 128 in total, protesters killed, they said this is genocide and we need to bomb the country into pieces. And the same thing when Yugoslavia was destroyed, they called it genocide. And they use that term, obviously, all the time strategically with political interests, and they stay quiet when they committed themselves. So right now, even, the Kirby is rejecting to use that term, and there are more than 25,000 people. I haven't checked the numbers today, but who have been killed by the genocidal Zionist regime. But I think, this is the whole issue that something that might have missed in the introduction is that me and Matteo will work together on a lot of projects, and one of them is related to, migration, forced migration, the politics of migration in the Mediterranean, political economy, kind of. And obviously, whenever we try to research it, especially in the English language, we notice that much of the information is being written by think tanks. And what kind of content are they producing? They're producing content that legitimizes the Mediterranean operation by the EU called Frontex, which is kind of a militarized border zone where NATO expands southwards. They call Libya their southern neighborhood. and they frame it as Libya not a security threat, but this is the soft power they use. They say they're a security partner, and so Libya becomes like the border of the EU as opposed to Libya being a sovereign state acting on its own. But so this is kind of like the role of think tanks. They're also logic making. They manufacture like the consensual ideology of like EU is good and doing all of the security things. But so in your view, and this is I maybe I've missed it in your book, but is there a recipe for counter hegemony? Is there a recipe for counter think tanks? How can we contest the hegemony of these think tanks?
No, I don't have a good solution. Actually, if you look in the conclusion of that book I made on think tanks, I didn't really have a great way of countering, because this is if you control the knowledge, then you can control everyone's understanding of an issue, and that's a problem, because now you have a whole generation of academics growing up, and they they have to study a topic, and then they delve into the literature which has been produced by arms industry committed to NATO and Israel, and so it's very destructive, because by definition, academia should be about the ability to also challenge what are considered to be acceptable, existing narratives. You should be able to contest it, have a critical view, and we're doing there's a great effort to do the exact opposite, tell one narrative and then slaughter anything that goes against it. So it's it's what can I say? It's just very, very, very unfortunate. But I don't really have a good solution for it. I guess it's only to try to do independent research. Try to look for facts. Just make sure you know your topic properly. So if people call you out on anything you write, that you're able to defend your argument properly. The problem is when they come for you, they won't come for your argument. They will go after the person. They will, you're an apologist for Hamas. You're an apologist for Russia. You don't care about human rights. You hate someone. You're anti-Semite. They will go for the person, not the argument. So it's difficult for people. They had BBC had a survey or a study where they found out that in Britain, at least, a lot of young academics were very intimidated and cautious to challenge too many existing narratives, because if you're not properly established yet, they can clip you very, very, very easily. So among young academics, especially, it's we see more being more intimidated, which means it's more likely to just jump in and support the existing narrative, which is unfortunate. That defeats the whole purpose of having a critical debate. But
you're right, Glenn. I mean, it just sounds like you're just talking about this situation of many young academics, that they just, in order to move to the next contract, they definitely need to toe the line, because obviously nobody's going to give you a contract if by any chance, you are proposing an argument, or you are researching from a perspective that does not question the mainstream understanding of political events. And on this point, in fact, one thing that I wanted to ask you is, I know you shared on Twitter once, you made this post where you shared that this Norwegian newspaper made a very lengthy article about you, actually, right? Am I correct? Like 6 pages?
oh yeah, no, 7 plus plus front page.
Please, just enlighten us what happened.
Which newspaper was this?
Morgenbladet.
I mean, yeah, just tell us what happened to you since you started. You're trying to rationally explain and provide a critical perspective over Russian geostrategy and politics. Okay, what did you become?
Well, it's I wish I had a shorter answer to it, but again, I mentioned the National Endowment for Democracy earlier on, right? This was established in 1983, very openly. This was because CIA operations, they got caught always. Reagan said, "Let's do it in the open." So this is it's been confirmed by a lot of CIA people. even the co-founder of National Endowment for Democracy said, what we're doing now used to be done by the CIA. So anyways, they develop all these human rights NGOs, and the main argument is, we care about human rights, and if this is what we do, then you have source credibility, because now you're a specialist and the only thing you hear about is human rights. But then human rights is always interpreted as criticizing our adversaries, no, not our own governments. So for example, so it ends up functioning as propaganda. Anyways, you have one of these think tanks in Norway, or sorry, NGO. Again, it's one of these non-governmental organizations which are almost completely funded by the government, but they're still non-governmental, and they're supposed to be objective, but they only look at human rights abuses, east of Vienna, pretty much. They call themselves the Helsinki Committee. Anyways, long story short, when I moved back to Norway in 2000, pretty much got almost right off the plane, they began to write articles about me in the paper. There's a very typical strategy. They start by, first saying, he used to engage with Russian media. He wrote articles in RT. But if you're a professor of Russian politics, you lived in Russia, imagine being the other way around, canceling, Russian academics that talk to our media and they get cancelled when they get home. But anyways, it seems like the most normal thing, because you just say, well, it's propaganda. Russia has propaganda. He engages with the Russian media. He engages with propaganda, and then they, of course, interview the rector of the university, saying, "Hey, did you know we have a propagandist there? We're with a human rights organization, paid by the CIA." But never mind. So they begin to write this, and they write the article one after another. It's same guy as well, and then they go on Twitter all the time. Every tweet they put the Twitter handle of the university to make sure that the shaming is of the university as well. Like, why would you have a propagandist here? Anyways, it didn't work. The rector said, we have free speech. We might not agree with everything he says, but this is academia. So they began then to take different strategies, and then the article you mentioned was a fascinating one, because it was 7 pages plus front, yes. And the main argument was, well, not only is he a propagandist, but he's in breach of international law, because it's against international law to spread war propaganda. And it was an awkward article, because they recognized that I opposed the invasion of Ukraine from the first day, but I still talk to Russian media, I write articles there. So that means I'm supporting their media, and their media does war propaganda. And war propaganda is against international law. And if you try to follow this very weird logic, then I'm breaking international law. So they tried to use that as a pressure to get me fired as well. And again, this is what you have to put up with. So it's and also that article was published in the newspaper where the guy from the Helsinki Committee, his wife is the editor there, one of the editors. So it's just a very banana republic. But this is where we are, though. It's a very hostile environment. So you have to ask, why would academics want to go through this? Because they keep writing this nonsense about me in the papers. You even had a guy from a TV channel here. You should know it, at the TV2. He used to write articles for the Atlantic. There's a think tank called the Pro NATO think tank, and he wrote also
Pro democracy, Glenn. Sorry.
Pro democracy. Yeah. And he wrote how I was a propagandist. But he had also worked in that for that think tank. He had written the Norwegian section for this huge series called the Kremlin's Trojan Horses, where effectively every political party, any journalist, anyone, they don't have to be pro-Russian, but if they haven't sufficiently supported sanctions, they're effectively shamed and blacklisted by this think tank. And so he was the one who wrote it for Norway, and it's quite absurd, because he called some of our political parties, like you should know them as some like FRP, SV, all of these, they're all Russian, they're all Trojan horses of the Kremlin. Like, really, FRP, this guy, they have they don't even like Russia. It's a weirdest thing. But anyone who doesn't criticize sufficiently is hanged out. And then I come, and I used to be a lot on RT when I lived in Russia. I write for them afterwards, and so immediately, again, I pretty much hadn't gone off the plane before they jumped up as well. So it's just the way it is, and you have to ask yourself, why would any academic want to go through all of this? Because you get your face in the paper. My kids read it in school. It's just it's very it's makes it very difficult. But
it does.
Yeah, and I think understandably you might have freedom of speech within academia in Norway, but this whole notion of tagging people and defaming them and saying, oh, look at this is propagandist for China or Russia or whatever, I just want to bring attention to potentially the listeners that a couple of months ago, New York Times tagged progressive organizations in the US and outside as receiving money from a China billionaire or Chinese affiliated billionaire. And then in India, NewsClick website was shut down and the journalists were imprisoned. And so on a global scale, this is a very scary thing, this whole idea of like canceling. It actually leads to people's not only livelihood as jobs are being lost or whatever, or being doxxed and shamed, but they actually might even lose their lives across the globe when all of these, and I guess this is also, they're relying on the inhumanity of this whole system. These people, the bots who go, oh, look at Glenn, he works for Kremlin. If you want to mail him something, just send a package to Kremlin and it'll get to Glenn. That's kind of the jokes, and then they tag you in it. If you were living in another country that has less freedom of speech, let's just call it in that liberal sense, you might actually be hurt or even harmed in a way that's unprecedented. But now going back to this whole the war in Ukraine, and also your positionality within Norway, I recall when I'm following Norwegian politics is that before 2022, there was just one party who was opposing to NATO, and that was the Red Party. But then right now, there's nobody opposed to NATO. Everybody is like pro-NATO, pro-militarism. Nord Stream pipeline, we didn't blow it up. It just happened by itself, but it's a good happenstance. And so what's the situation in Norway in terms of like this intensified militarization, the laughable quote that in order to get peace, we need to send more weapons. How is it going?
No, it was the one political party who used to be against sending weapons, also opposing sending weapons into conflict zones. But you still had some renegade politicians within that party who still said this was wrong and it would only prolong the conflict. They even invited one on a debate, and afterwards, you got death threats and comparing him to serial killers and because it's just two sides. Either you support what NATO's doing, or you hate Ukrainians, and this is the only. This is the only option people are given, and it's quite weird. And you have this, send weapons are the path to peace. This is Jens Stoltenberg, our former prime minister, who's now the NATO Secretary General. He keeps saying that over and over again, which is a very strange thing to say, but also at the same time, anyone who disagrees with them, they're spreading war propaganda, disinformation, hate. They also have to be censored, which is why it's funny, because I also made the point once on Twitter that this sounds like, he should almost copyright infringement of George Orwell. Well, as war is peace, ignorance is strength. It's just it's and you can't contest any of this. So it's quite it's quite surprising how far this has gone, and. I don't know. It's this is another thing that bothers me, because these people, in my opinion, they have caused so much death and destruction now. Also, a huge part of the guilt of what has happened to Ukraine, and still, they relish in this kind of idea that they're very virtuous and they have done everything to help Ukraine. But who are these people? I keep making a point. Between 1991 and 2014, these people who were pushing for having Ukraine join NATO, it was only 20% of Ukrainians consistently, every poll in this period, who wanted to join NATO, and still they kept pushing for it. And then 2014, they toppled the government, and I keep asking, well, why would we do this? And it's like, oh, we did it to help Ukraine, but but they had a democratically elected government. The majority population didn't even support the riots in Maidan. Far less supported an actual coup. So why did we do that to help them? And then, of course, we supported the anti-terrorist operation against their own people. Ended up with 14,000 dead people. We also did this to help Ukraine. And then, and it never matter what actually happens in Ukraine. And I keep pointing out also in 2019, the Ukrainians voted, for Zelensky's peace platform. 73% voted for Zelensky. And he had, he said, we'll talk to Donbass, we'll make peace with the Russians, we'll implement the Minsk agreement. And the Americans supported this right-wing groups, many of them fascists, such as Azov, who were able to overturn it. And it's well documented. Both Poroshenko first had the parliamentary support to implement Minsk. He was forced to reverse. Then Zelensky also had a huge mandate. They threatened his life, these American-trained fascists, and he also had to flip afterwards. So all of this is well documented. And still, we say we did this to help Ukraine. So even after the Russians invaded, as we know, we say you can't negotiate with the Russians, but it's already here on black and white. The media covered it. On the first day after the invasion, the Russians reached out to the Ukrainians saying, "Listen, you've seen we're willing to use military force. Let's sit down and resolve this issue now." And then the Ukrainians said, "Yeah, okay, we'll talk to you. No preconditions." The Americans yet again want to help Ukraine by saying, "No, we don't accept that. There will be preconditions. We won't even talk to Russia before they pull out." Well, this is capitulation. That's not a peace negotiation. So, even despite all this, yet again, they sat down, they tried to negotiate in Istanbul. You have the Israeli mediators, you have the Turkish ones. They're all confirming the same thing. They had a deal. Russia just wanted one thing. That was neutrality, no more NATO expansion. And the Americans and British said, "No way, we will not accept this. But if you fight the Russians, we'll give you all the weapons you need." This has been confirmed. Even one of the heads of Zelensky's political party has recognized this. A German general, a former leader of Bundeswehr, all of them confirmed this. But yet, why did they do this to the Ukrainians? Why did they sabotage the peace? Oh, to help Ukraine. Even the Ukrainian military, they didn't want to do this counteroffensive. They knew this was going to end in tragedy. But for the Americans, they're fighting with Ukrainians. Dead Ukrainians doesn't mean anything. If you can kill some Russians, who cares? So the Ukrainians go out in the media, said, we strongly oppose this, but we were, the Americans, pressured us into doing it. Why would they do this? Oh, to help Ukraine. So we always say we help Ukraine, and we keep, doing horrible things to them. Again, the overarching thing was, what did we think was going to happen? I mean, if China or Russia was pressuring or trying to establish a military alliance with Mexico, they wouldn't be helping Mexico. America would bomb that country to the ground before they would ever let that happen. And the same goes for Russia. We never helped Ukraine, and it bothers me so much that these people put their little Ukrainian flag in their bios and try to portray themselves as being, very sympathetic and caring. Yet not a single one of them wanted to accept. We could have improved things for Ukraine. We could have gone to the Russians and said, "Listen, we'll promise no more NATO expansion. We'll give you the pan-European security guarantees, which you wanted in 2021, which you wanted since 1991, for that sake. And but then you have to give back some territory or something to help the Ukrainians." No one's going to do that, because we're not here to help Ukraine. We're here to advance American interests. So it's, but again, it doesn't matter. If you talk to the media here, it's like America's just Amnesty International with nuclear weapons. They're just out to spread the democracy. And you can't contest it. So it's sorry, I get frustrated sometimes.
Yeah, it's good. No, because personally, and as mentioned, like I've lived in Norway a couple of years and I've interacted with a lot of people. It's very rare to hear these voices, and very rarely to see people question, be it Jens Stoltenberg now as a head of NATO, or even when he was prime minister in charge of the NATO campaign in Libya. And people are also in Denmark are not critical of Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was prime minister of Denmark during the interventions in Iraq, and then he became the head of NATO in 2011. People don't question the lineages of these people. And then also like the quote where Stoltenberg said, and people are not questioning, he said, before Russia unprovocatively invaded Ukraine, obviously 2022, they told us that if we pull out all of our military equipment from all countries that joined NATO after the 1991 and have like NATO-free area without equipment, but they're still part of NATO, they would be willing to not attack Ukraine, right? And then Jens Stoltenberg said courageously, but we said no. And the funny part is that not only did Russia is losing this war right now, they also got more NATO on their borders by Finland joining, right? And so this the way that they frame the increased militarization, the forced even militarization. I wish if like Finnish people could have a referendum and voted on joining NATO or not. That would be interesting results to see. But it just tells you like, look, Russia is not only losing the war, they're losing also the propaganda war and the war against NATO and expansionism. But in reality, like what's actually happened to NATO, it's losing its credibility as a so-called defensive organization that actually tries to protect Europe from foreign activities. But nobody is questioning that. Even I think in Norway, despite the destructive behavior of NATO in Yugoslavia, despite its destructive behavior in Libya in 2011, and the respective countries' interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. It's just a personal comment. I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but I'm just frustrated as much as you are.
No, it's very strange. People don't ask questions about any of this. Like, not just Iraq now. Like we were actually opposed to the war in Iraq, but these days, our country, we have soldiers in Iraq. The Iraqi parliament has asked all foreign troops to leave, and we won't leave. That doesn't make us an occupation force. And same as the Americans now, not just in Iraq, but in Syria, they're occupying the territory. They're plundering the resources, the agriculture, oil. Nothing doesn't even deserve a headline. And I would like to see how that would be flipped as being about democracy, but. It's just it gets very frustrating because the narratives they never challenged. And I think maybe that's why the politicians get lazy sometimes, because all these politicians, they all go and, as you mentioned, they all say the same thing. This had nothing to do with NATO, nothing to do with NATO. But suddenly Stoltenberg is talking on a different topic where he wants to celebrate how they didn't want NATO, now they got Sweden and Finland, and then suddenly goes, yeah. Putin, he said, they would invade if we didn't, promise to neutrality for Ukraine. They didn't want more NATO expansion. That's why he invaded Ukraine. So suddenly he contradicts himself. He says exactly, but now he was telling a different story. He was gonna, rub Putin's nose in, getting all of Scandinavia into NATO. So it's just it's dishonest. And if we had a proper media, then they would pick up on this. But they can't, because nothing matters. Facts doesn't matter. If you point this out, same as with the Russiagate. If you would point out any of it, then any of the inconsistencies or objectively things that are very clearly fake, then they don't care what's reality or not. They just see, well, who does reality serve? Well, now you're by calling Russiagate fake or proving it, well, then you're giving legitimacy to Russia and giving legitimacy to Trump. You can't do that, and it's the same here. You can't criticize NATO or Zelensky. Then you're taking the side of Russia. So facts should be objective. They shouldn't have any. They should have value of their own, but it doesn't. It's only the narrative they serve. We had an interview with Colonel Wilkerson. Actually, he's the chief of staff under Colin Powell. He was very much didn't care for this invasion of Iraq. But anyways, we had an interview. It was very fascinating because he actually said, that Stoltenberg more or less was rewarded because Norway dropped 10% of the bombs on Libya. So that was the prize. You become the NATO Secretary General. And I thought it was interesting because this week there's in the Dutch media, they say Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, he's on his way out. So, but he's like a top candidate for taking over the NATO top job. And the article is quite critical in the Netherlands because it shows, the Dutch government's willing to do anything to get this job. So, he's willing to ignore or anything of Israeli war crimes should be brushed under the rug because, this shows your loyalty to America. He's super anti-Russian and send all the weapons in the world to Ukraine. So this is the credentials. You're a super war hawk, and then the Americans will reward you, and you can be part of this defensive, lead the defensive alliance, which keeps attacking countries who hasn't threatened it. So yeah.
Glenn, then to follow up on this, just probably two more questions we have. I know we have to go. We don't want to take too much time, but really.
Sorry, too long answers, I think.
No. This is, it's wonderful to be talking to you. You're frustrated. We are as much frustrated. So, I hope anybody who's frustrated about what's happening in Ukraine, I hope is going to read your work and listen to you, because really you provide us some logic here. So going back now to Ukraine. So has been doing the rounds, this very short clip of a NATO, I don't remember exactly his title, a general, I think it's Bob Bauer. I don't know if he's Swedish or American, but it's basically where he talks and he says, Europeans have to prepare for war with Russia in the next 20 years. You need flashlights, you need water in the house, and all this. Now, the prompt of this is basically, how do you currently see the balance of forces in Ukraine? Do you see a change of the narrative happening? What are the options that you can see unfolding right now? I know this is speculative at the end of the day, but as somebody who's been following, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the war is being lost by NATO and Ukraine quite quickly. I think we fail to report on it properly because we keep treating us by measuring everything in territory. But this is a war of attrition, which means you exhaust your enemy and then you take the territory. Because going on the offensive, you take a lot of casualties. So it's better to grind down the adversary before you make these big arrow moves. And if you look at all the numbers, the Russians are, firing, some places sometimes 10 times more artillery than the Ukrainians. They dominate in drones, they dominate in missiles, they dominate in air in terms of fighters, helicopters, armored vehicles, pretty much every electronic warfare, effectively every single measurable category which you would have in the war of attrition, the Russians are dominating, and for that reason they are the casualty rate in terms of how many the Ukrainians are losing versus the Russians are very, very favorable to Russia. So a lot more Ukrainian soldiers are falling and equipment being destroyed. And it sounds very grotesque, but that's how you measure war of attrition. And meanwhile, over the past year, you saw Ukraine using all its manpower and all the weapons supplied by NATO to hammer on these Russian defensive lines, which they couldn't break through. So they had these huge losses, and at the same time, while the Russians, had played defensive and had minimal losses, they built up a huge force in the background. They mobilized hundreds of thousands of men, which they have in the rear, produced a crazy amount of ammunition and military hardware. We keep trying to mock the Russian economy just being a gas station masquerading as a country, but they're now outproducing the entirety of NATO in artillery shells, for example. So, and in addition, they're sourcing, weaponry from other places. So by every measurement, the Russians are winning, and making matters worse, we ran just now that the Russians are on peak of arms production, and a huge amount of people are volunteering for joining the army. NATO says they don't really have any more weapons to send. The Americans are sending this cluster ammunition because Biden openly said we don't have any more artillery shells. So every single measurable indicator you see that this is a victory coming. In terms of the narrative, I think that's been fake all along. I think in the beginning of the war, it was Ukraine is winning, but this was because the Russian forces had to pull back from many areas. But that was because when the Russians went in, they went in with, was it 140,000 men or 90,000, but a few tens of thousands on the outside. Everyone agrees this amount of force was just to get the Ukrainians to agree to Russian terms. It wasn't meant to conquer the whole country. It's ridiculous. And the fact that the Russians on day one stormed the country and then used that opportunity to asked to negotiate with Ukraine is kind of proof of this. But nonetheless, when the Americans convinced them you should fight, the whole war changed. The Russians couldn't hold on to this long, undefended supply chain, so they had to pull back from a lot of regions. That's when our narrative began. Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning. Let's pour weapons in, and we can defeat the Russians. But then, of course, now things have changed a bit, and now we're saying, oh, well, the front lines are frozen. This will be, a quagmire. The front lines aren't moving, which is fake again, because now we see the Ukrainians have exhausted their manpower, equipment, everything. And when one thing's go wrong, everything else goes wrong. So now, of course, they're having they're having more desperate recruitment, getting older people who don't want to be there, women. But then the defensive lines are less reliable. You see people deserting greater extent. People are surrendering more, and suddenly an entirety of new problems are emerging. Yes, just see the collapse of missile defense. Every missile now seems to go through, every drone goes through and hit their targets. Now weapon depots are blowing up everywhere. So things are just deteriorating very fast. The political leadership, you had the political leadership, the military, then you had all of these right-wing extremist groups, which the American had been arming. They only had unity in wanting to defeat Russia. Now that they can't defeat Russia, they seem to be turning on each other. So everything is falling apart very quickly. And if we had any decency in NATO, we would sit down with Russia now and negotiate something reasonable, and ideally give the Ukrainian this huge bargaining power of offering the Russian a pan-European security agreement. But instead, and this is what really baffles me, nothing is being done. They're not sending weapons. They're not negotiating. They're just watching things fall apart. So this is, heartbreaking and horrific to watch.
It is horrific to watch. I mean, I was just, we were just talking about the other day about this plane that was bombed of prisoners of war as well. It's just by the Ukrainians. I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's really heart-wrenching to see what is happening in Ukraine anyway. It's really like and also I completely don't understand, what is the strategy of Europe? I mean, I just don't understand. Apart from, a forever war, possibly that could be, but it's just,
But this is so, I always been very realist at core, so I kind of see always values and norms being used instrumentally as power politics, like the way to framing. But still, I kind of always assume there's something, there has to be some nugget of truth there, some core values. But after Ukraine, hundreds of thousands now dead. And these are, husbands, fathers, these sons. This is, horrific. And then, so the same in the Nagorno-Karabakh with all these people. The EU didn't care. They saw it as a strategic advantage. The Russians are losing an ally. And then, of course, now in Gaza, just thousands and thousands of dead kids. And the EU, the most it could muster to do was said, yeah, we'll support a ceasefire if Hamas dismantles itself and capitulates. I mean, this is greenlighting genocide. It's quite horrific, and so all.
Glenn, don't let us start going to Palestine because we've been really it's it touches close to so many things. It's just too much what we're seeing. When I think of Nazi people, I think of von der Leyen. Honestly, that's the way I really start to rethink Nazism in my head. It's just unbelievable the position of Europe in all this. I mean, yeah, we saw Russia. It's just that Palestine has been so glaring in a way, but I want to close with you on this point. Actually, I wanted to draw back to Palestine. Why? Because for us, it's difficult to understand one thing, and I don't know how much you have to say about that, but what is the perception of the conflict, of the war, of the genocide from the Russian perspective? How do you see Russia is upholding international law? Is that the official position of Russia? Because it also has a very distinct relationship with Israel at the same time. So how do you see, Russian position vis-a-vis what is happening right now in Gaza?
Well, Russia's been very openly very critical of Israel. They even started to openly contest some of the legitimacy they're claiming. So, for example, saying that just because a horrific genocide was committed against the Jews in Europe, it doesn't give the green card to commit one against the Palestinians. So they kind of went very hard after the Israelis. I think this is quite unusual for both historical and strategic reasons, because historically, of course, Israel and Russia was always somewhat close. Ever since the Russians liberated the Jews from Auschwitz and all of this, they always, I don't know, I remember talking to various Israeli leaders as well, who kind of confirmed, we always saw Russia in special light because of this, but this was to a large extent reciprocated by the Russians. However, I think two things have happened here. One would be the scale of this. I think that shook the Russians as well. The amount of destruction taking place in Gaza. But also, second, was the betrayal they felt over Ukraine, because the Israelis were sending trainers, weapons, and effectively, killing Russians. So this is, I think, a lot of love was lost on that area. But beyond that, I think I was a bit surprised, because we often get used to these alliance systems, which it's quite common for hegemonic power to do, to use alliance system. This is also, by the way, very detrimental to have peacetime military alliances, because it's very destabilizing. But this is what a hegemon would do, to divide and conquer you. Some are dependent on you, and the other one is weakened. So in the Middle East, you want to make the Arabs dependent on you to weaken the Iranians, and then you dominate. But the Chinese and Russians, they kind of pursued a different approach with the this Eurasian integration format. But then they need to get along with everyone, and this is so they want to get along with Iran. But if they get close to Iran, they also have to get close to the Saudis. The Russians are doing the same. They want to be close to India, then they also have to be close to Pakistan. And this is why you saw the Chinese had a better peace potential in the Middle East, because they want to integrate with the whole region. Well, then they have to make peace between the Saudis and Iranians and the other Arabs. So they have always. So this is the path that the Russians were going. My point was the Russians do not want to alienate the Israelis, but I think the destruction and the betrayal in Ukraine is something that really changed that calculation to a large extent.
Essam, do you have anything to say, or should we?
No, I think this was very enlightening, and as you Norwegians say, hjertelig takk for din tid. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. So Matteo.
Grazie, Glenn. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure, I hope we'll have another conversation anytime soon. Unfortunately, for this very unfortunate events that surround us, I wish we could talk less about death and war and more about what we're going to eat tonight. But in any case, I tell to all our listeners to pick up any of the books that our Professor Glenn Diesen has written on Russia, on Russian geostrategic policy, but also as well on Western propaganda and academic participation.
Yeah, I have a new book coming out in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks as well. It's on the 15th of February. It's called "The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order." It's.
Okay, do you have can we know the press or something, so that we know where to look at?
It's $30. So I kind of learned from
the
academic publishers tend to be very expensive, so I decided to go with a cheaper one to wider spread. Yeah.
To reach the masses, the ignorant masses. Otherwise, ignorance makes them too strong, as we said before. But Glenn, thank you so much again for joining us, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Anytime. Good to see both of you.